Delicious in Dungeon is about a group of adventurers who, when fighting a dragon, end up getting teleported out of the dungeon. And so one of the main characters, the human specifically, sister ends up getting eaten by the dragon. Now, in this dungeon, if you die in the dungeon, your soul is stuck in the dungeon, which allows resurrection magic to bring you back to life as long as they get a hold of your body. So, the main characters end up re-entering the dungeon to try and slay the dragon and save the sister by, getting her out of the dragon's stomach so that they can resurrect her. However, most of the party that they were with to fight the dragon ends up abandoning them. And so, only 3 people end up going in, and they're low on resources because they just got kicked out of the dungeon. So when they immediately re-enter it to try and save the sister, they aren't bringing any rations. And so the decision becomes to eat the monsters they find in the dungeon, which is considered a taboo because monsters are considered unclean. And then in the dungeon, the 3 main characters who enter it are an elf, a human, and a halfling. They're called different things in the show, but we know what archetypes they're playing with. And they end up encountering a dwarf who's really into cooking monsters, and so they all go on this big journey to find the sister and save her from the dragon while also encountering other monsters in the dungeon, and then inevitably eating them because the solid 1/4 of every episode is dedicated to cooking and eating monsters. Delicious in Dungeon was an anime that I didn't really want to watch initially, and I only decided to actually check out because everyone was talking about it and was saying how good it was. And unfortunately, I just really could not get into it as a show. The show itself isn't bad by any metric, and there are probably more things I actually like about the show than dislike. There's only one thing that I really have a problem with, but the problem is that one thing is enough to completely offset everything I actually do like about the show. So we're going to start with the stuff I actually liked about the show, which the quickest, easiest thing we can get through is I actually really like the art style of this and the character designs. I find them very aesthetically pleasing. There are a few characters who aren't particularly attractive, but it fits in well enough with the universe in a way that I feel like they don't have to be. And we also get to see our main cast of 4 or 5-ish characters change their outfits, change their clothes, and sometimes even due to shape-shifting mushrooms at one point, swap races or get duplicated due to shapeshifters. And so even when the characters are sort of intentionally off model, they still come out very aesthetically pleasing. It's a very good looking show. The other thing I think that the show does really well is more of a world building sort of thing. So because the characters have to eat the monsters in the dungeon, the show needs to make a way for the monsters to actually be edible. And so a lot of the episodes also have parts of the show dedicated to the actually cooking and preparation of the monsters, where what they're ending up eating isn't necessarily fantasy food. It is essentially just a substitution for what would be a real ingredient in the real world, and then they're just sort of making real recipes. I bet if you find the real world equivalent of what they're making, you can make probably every single dish in this entire show. But more importantly than that, the dwarf who likes cooking specifically cares a lot about the ecology of the dungeon. He wants to make sure that the ecosystems don't get offset, so he makes sure that the party never overkills the monsters they find. And so because of that, there is a sort of ecological focus on this dungeon. The dungeon has plants, and then herbivores that eat those plants, and then carnivores that eat those, and then apex predators. And the dungeon also explains how it rearranges itself, how the souls who are stuck in the dungeon end up behaving, what's going on with the spirits. It gets sort of into more how the dungeon repairs itself if it's damaged, why it's so clean. It gets into sort of more non-dungeon related topics, which is where we get to sort of the third thing, which is also basically the same thing, where it explains how its magic system ends up working, not in depth, but well enough that you get a good grasp on it. And also, we find out that this dungeon is just one of many dungeons. and that a lot of the dungeons are used as economic centers for the regions they're in. And also, in the long distant past, there was a war between the elves and the dwarves that, like, shot each other with a bunch of fucking super weapons, and they eventually stopped fighting. And so the current dungeon is in an area owned by a gnome man, and there is an elite squadron of elves who, if dungeons become too dangerous and start damaging the surrounding areas, the elves will just send in this, like, elite spec ops task force to just finish the fucking dungeon. The world building in this show is actually fantastic, and good as the intrigue plots are, I will have to say that Delicious in Dungeon manages to address the ecology of the dungeon far better than most other things I've seen. There's only like one or two other shows I've seen that managed to get this far into building from ground up an actual ecological environment for its fantasy world. There are also moments in the show where it decides to take itself super seriously. You can almost like feel it change in tone because it's mostly sort of like a lighthearted comedy series, but there are certain episodes or certain parts of episodes where shit gets real, and during these moments, you can actually like feel the tension. They're very well done, they're very dramatic, and it is just like, it's not necessarily because it's a tonal shift, it is just a really well-handled, tense, dramatic scenes that really get you excited and keep you invested in the action. There is one exception of this where I did not vibe with the clearly intentional serious scene, where the party is fighting the red dragon that kidnapped the main character's sister. And in that fight, I actually found myself kind of getting bored with it. But I think that's probably like the one misfire of it, as far as like all of the other serious, intense scenes were. Like, for example, like the cockatrice fight. Do I mean the cockatrice? Whatever. The chimera fight was like really well done. The one with the Undine fight, for example, was pretty impactful. And when they actually encounter the wizard that created the dungeon, very strong dramatic scenes in the show. Where I fall off with it, and what so heavily damaged my enjoyment of the actual show, is the characters, or most specifically, one specific character. There are characters in the show that I don't necessarily like, but I don't dislike, and I think they add well to the show itself. So there's like this one rival adventurer dude who's very self-righteous and super murder hobo-y, who thinks he's like a paragon of justice and virtue, and he's an intriguing character, and I don't dislike him. But I don't necessarily like him, but I'm not sure I'm supposed to. And the gnome who rules the whole dungeon, he's a huge asshole, but he's meant to be a huge asshole, so I think he fits in well. At one point, the three main cast members aren't the most well-developed, but I did end up really appreciating them over the course of the show. I probably started liking them around episode 15-ish, though, so it takes me a long time to get ingratiated to these characters. Because largely the characters just aren't the focus of the show. It's mostly the dungeon, the ecology, and the food. But they end up picking up a cat girl party member, and her first 3 episodes are fucking insufferable. But she ends up sort of chilling out as it goes on. But as she chills out and becomes a less, I would say, hateable character, and she becomes more integrated into the party, she also becomes less relevant to anything that is fucking happening. So I guess whenever she's focused on, she's obnoxious, and whenever she's not focused on, I don't understand why she's fucking there because she adds nothing to the goddamn show. But the actual number one issue that I have with Delicious in Dungeon is the dwarf named Senshi, who joins the party and is a cook. He actively detracts from the quality of the show because Senshi is super competent, especially at the beginning, where he knows all about the dungeon ecology. He knows how to prepare all of the foods. He is a pretty decent fighter. He's got the best equipment. And because he's so knowledgeable about the dungeon, he can pretty much handle, other than like the specific fight against the dragon and maybe the cockatrice, he can basically just handle the entire dungeon navigation that the characters do by himself. He basically invalidates a lot of the challenges they end up encountering. And what's more is that the actual number one issue is that his skill set overlaps too much with the other characters. So the human, basically, we're calling him a human. They call him a tall man in the show. I'm going to call him a human. The human whose sister ends up getting eaten by the dragon, he clearly has an obsession with monsters, and he has the most monster knowledge. But when the dwarf is first introduced, the dwarf has more monster knowledge than the human because the show felt the need to prove how knowledgeable the dwarf was. And the human wants to cook monster food, but then the dwarf ends up doing all of the cooking because he's the experienced cook. And his knowledge of monsters also overlaps with bits of like magical knowledge, which undermines the existence of the elf mage in the party. In certain instances, he never really takes over the halfling's rogue skill set. He never is like checking for traps or anything. In fact, he's actually quite bad at it. But the fact that he immediately inserts himself in the party, he is not directly relevant to the central conflict of saving the sister, and he ends up using his skill set, which too heavily overlaps with the other members of the party, to essentially do their jobs for them, ends up depreciating the value of the other members of the party to the point where there are multiple episodes dedicated to questioning how useful the elf mage actually is in the party, which is not something that should ever actually be happening. You should not be going through the show wondering why this character is relevant to the adventure in the first place. And the problem is that the dwarf is so overpowering in his expertise that you end up doing this for the majority of the cast. This is a problem that gets better over time as the show allows the dwarf to have his own flaws and his own lack of knowledge. And he becomes more what he should have been from the beginning, which is basically the cook. But even then, I have to question if the human was so enthused about cooking monsters and he has a cookbook for monsters, why the show couldn't have just let him cook? Why could he not be in charge of the monster knowledge, which he was already in charge of? And why could he not share that with the mage, who also was aware of the monsters? It seems like the dwarf overlaps so much with the other skill set that he doesn't have his own unique skill set. And as the show goes on, part of the thing that the show is trying to build towards seems to be that the human man is picking up the skills of his party members. So he's learning magic from the mage, he learns about monster ecology and learns about cooking from the dwarf. And at the tail end, and I'm just assuming this is the direction the show plans to go with it, he ends up learning a bit about like trap perception when he ends up in like a halfling body. Hasn't learned anything from the cat girl. Not sure how much there is to learn about cat girl stuff, though, to be fair. And I think part of this is that the show talks about how he has a prophecy where he is supposed to basically take out the mage and become the owner of the dungeon/country. And so I think that's where they're building towards, but that just sort of exemplifies the exact issue with the dwarf already, but it also adds the problem to his character as well, where the show's putting too many eggs in one basket, and it's creating too much of a general knowledge center around its characters to the points where any one individual character is less important to the function of the group, and so they don't have a specific place in the plot or narrative. There's also the thing where the mage is trying to learn specifically the type of magic utilized by the wizard who created the dungeon, but the show doesn't really develop over it. And ever since like episode 2, where she's cursing her lack of knowledge, she ends the show when we learn more about the dungeon and more about it, still cursing that she doesn't know how to use the ancient magic used by the wizard. So she doesn't really develop her skill set much as it goes on. Her only real character development is that she ends up becoming more okay with eating monsters when she wasn't initially, but that's not really much of a character development, and I think it's a shame because personally I find her to be the most likable, personable character in the entire show. I know a lot of people are into the human guy. He's not bad. I don't hate the main 3 trio that entered the dungeon initially. It's just, more specifically, I don't see the purpose of the cat girl, and I'm not super fond of her, and I come to appreciate the dwarf as the show goes on, but largely for most of the show, I do find him a bit insufferable just because he takes away the purpose of all of the other cast members. And I know it sounds insane to have praised the show so heavily for all of the things it did and only dislike the one thing, but I am not joking when I'm saying if it was just the trio, not the cat girl, not the dwarf, who enters the dungeon and then they encounter the other side characters, I genuinely think Delicious in Dungeon would be a significantly better show. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your envoy of hope. Bye-bye.